Good morning. How's everyone doing today? Hey, I am so appreciative of the fact that you guys are here as we dive into a new series. And if you are new, or maybe you haven't been here in a while and you just need a reminder of who we are as a church, we're not like all the other churches in town. We are a church for those who have given up on church, which means basically this, that we want to be a place where you feel safe and seen and heard and loved, and you get to hear a message about how God has a purpose for your lives. And we believe that these things are found ultimately in the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. And so even if you are not a Jesus follower and you're here and you're like, man, I'm here because my parent brought me, a spouse, a family member, or maybe I feel like I'm supposed to be here because I need to be a good person, let me go ahead and tell you something. You're off the hook for this series because this series is not about you. Because in this series, we are primarily talking about how we worship Jesus Christ and what that looks like for the Jesus follower. So if you are not a Jesus follower, I'm going to let you off the hook. You don't really have to be here for this series because this doesn't apply to you. But I will say this, that it does impact you if the Jesus followers in your life take this seriously. If the Jesus followers look at what does Jesus have to say about what it means to worship him, and they put those into practice, I promise you it's going to be a benefit to your life. And that's what we're going to be looking at. Of what does worship look like? And now when we typically think of worship, we think of the songs we sing. But when we look at what the first century church looked at, and why we say first century is because they were the beginning. They were the people who followed Jesus, who heard his teaching, who wrote it down in these historical documents we have. What they said about worship is not the same arguments that we tend to make. Like we tend to argue over song selection and styles and whether or not the band and the preacher is in skinny jeans and ripped jeans and things like that. Like that's what we are oftentimes more concerned of when it comes to worship. But the first century church, the church that turned the world upside down, the church that brought the Roman Empire to its knees, had a different idea about what worship was. It's not that songs didn't matter. It's that something else mattered much more. It's that they lived a life that can be summarized by this simple phrase, all hail the King. Because worship for them meant bowing down to something. It meant the direction of your life. We can see this when we look at some of their ancient historical documents, the things they wrote down that they passed around and taught to others. One of them was written by a guy named Paul. He writes this letter to the Romans, and it's a letter to the Romans. We just heard it read by Dave, but let me go ahead and read it again for us. It's Romans chapter 12, verse 1, where Paul told the church in Rome this. He said, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, meaning he's talking to Jesus followers. He's like, let me urge you to listen to what I'm about to say. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, meaning in response to what Jesus has done for you, here's what I am going to ask of you. That you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Paul's point was that worship was about a lifestyle. It's about more than just coming in together to sing songs. It involved every minute of your day. And for us as a church, we want to live up to what Paul wrote. We want to be a church of people who are worshiping as living sacrifices. And part of that means we must learn how we prepare for our time of worship, which is what we're going to talk about today. And in that, I need to address a very ugly truth. That maybe you've had this thought. Maybe you've had this thought today. In fact, I'm going to say something, and you're like, ooh, Mason, you're just like in my mind. I thought this on the way here, right? And I certainly bet that maybe it's a reason why you have left former churches because of this thought right here. Let me go ahead and tell you what it is. It's this. I get nothing from worship. You ever thought about that? Ever had that thought? Maybe this one was your thought. Worship makes no difference in my life. I feel nothing by coming to church. And then finally, I don't see the point of what this is supposed to accomplish. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I'm betting that maybe some of you are like, man, I thought that. I thought that today. I've thought that in the past. I'll be honest, I'm one of those. So I'm not saying this to shame anyone. I'm not saying this to judge anyone. I'm saying that this is a serious question that we need to look at. If we're going to look at what does it mean to live a life that says, all hail the King. Now here's the wonderful thing. That Jesus has something to say about that mentality when it seeps into our brains. He has something to say about how we approach God. And it's wonderful because he is God in the flesh. And so he has something wonderful to say to us, I think, this morning. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I'm going to give you a little spoiler. It's not comfortable. And what we're going to look at, what Jesus has to say, might lead to some of you like, I'm never coming back to church ever again because of what Jesus said. I'm serious. Some of you might seriously think, man, I am not a real Jesus follower because I do not want to live to that standard. And with that on the table, let's join in prayer, all right? Father God, I'm going to ask you, please, Father, to just speak clearly in your word this morning. I'll be honest, Father, what I've been wrestling with for weeks, looking at this topic and these few verses that you say, these few short sentences that just rock our world. I'll be honest, I'm one of those, I look at it, I'm like, man, I struggle with this because this is not easy. And so I'm going to ask, Father, would you just speak now to our hearts? Would you open up our eyes to see you, to hear you, and to not just be convicted this morning, but we might actually do something so that we might live lives that other people can say, man, if we had to summarize that life, that is a life that says, all hail the King. Jesus, you are that King. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Now, before we can get into what Jesus says about how we prepare for our time of worship together, we actually have to understand the context of what he was in and what he is speaking to. You see, he was a part of a people group known as the Jews in the first century, right? That's 2,000 years ago. And in that day and age, the Jews had a lot to say about worship. We have a lot of historical documents that are kept for us, that have been preserved through history, that show us what was it like to worship God as a Jew. And here's what basically it was. They had a lot of very strict rules. They took a lot of interest in how they prepared to come together to worship because they believed they were worshiping a holy, righteous, and dangerous God. So they would put a lot of effort in how they prepare. They would obey all these laws, they would perform all these rituals, and then they would travel to the temple to worship. Now, keep in mind, they don't have a church on every street corner like we do. They had a single temple in their entire nation. And so if you were going to worship, it took weeks and months of preparation. You would save a lot of your income so you can buy an animal to sacrifice that met the qualifications. You would wait hours and hours in this line. We're talking about something that you get to do just maybe a few times a year, and it took a lot of preparation. And on the way there, you're probably hiking for about 3 days to get to church, okay? So some of you are like, man, I'm not willing to drive more than 5 minutes to church, right? And here's the people who would walk for 3 days. We're talking about 80 miles, walking to get to the temple to worship God. And along the way, they'd be singing songs. Some of them we've been fortunate enough to be able to read in history, like this one, that goes like this. It's from Psalm 95, and they'd say, "Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before Yahweh our Maker." They were very adamant in how they prepared for worship. It was a serious deal because they were meeting with a holy, righteous, and dangerous God. And they were so adamant, saying, we have to get this right, because they believed that if they got it wrong, that God would not care for them, that God would abandon them, that he would turn the other way. And they have a history that makes them believe that. Because they are a people who are oppressed by the Romans. And the reason why they think the Romans have come and taken over them is because they have failed and they have been unfaithful in the past. And so they think, man, if we can buckle down now, if we can get this right, if we can worship God the way that God, we think God wants to be worshiped, then God will come and rescue us. Then God will defeat our enemies. And so they were so incredibly adamant of, we must get this right. But you know what happens when you create a culture like that? Competition starts to build. You don't look at your neighbor in the same way. You start looking at them as, man, they're my competition. I must appear holier than they. I must appear like my life is put together. They can't know what I am facing. So you do all this work, all this preparation to make it seem like you were perfect and that you were living a perfect life. You notice how people still live that way? Like, I'll be honest, I'm just going to go ahead and go a little off script. If you came in this morning and you felt like, man, no one can know what's going on in my life, no one can know what I'm facing and my struggles. No one can know my mistake. I have to appear perfect. Let me tell you, you are not worshiping the Jesus that we see in the Gospels. You are following an old pattern, not the way of Jesus. Because Jesus speaks into the space and he offers freedom. He offers grace and mercy. He offers a new beginning, a liberation. And so he speaks to people who are like, man, I'm all about trying to seem more perfect than everyone else. And if you came in this culture, if you live in that culture, you would sit there and think, I've got to get my life right before I go meet with God. And then Jesus comes and he says, let's talk about this. Let's change this. And so he gathers together a bunch of people, and they're believing that he's the Messiah. They believe he's the one who is God's promised deliverer, who's going to save them. And he starts to talk to them in Matthew chapter 5 about what does it look like to be part of God's family? What does it look like to worship? And he doesn't begin by talking about song selection. He begins in the most unusual way possible to talk about worship. Here's what he says. It's in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. He says this. He says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. All right, I'll be honest. It's kind of weird to start talking about worship by starting talking about murder. All right, you're like, okay, where are we going to go with this? But this is something that was so crucial for that people in that day and age because he's referring to something called the 10 Commandments. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you're like, I can name about 3 of them, right? That's probably most of us, and one of them is probably thou shalt not murder, right? And think about this. God gave these 10 Commandments to the ancient people Israelites about roughly maybe 2,000 years before Jesus comes on the scene. And it was all about structuring a nation on how are you going to be a people of justice and mercy. And so if you're going to be a people of justice and mercy, not murdering people is probably step 1, correct? And think about this. We all enjoy this rule, right? We all like to be around people that we are pretty confident won't murder us. I mean, that's why some of you, you're like, you chose the seat you are in this morning because you want to be around people who make you feel safe. I say that when there's no one sitting around me and Jody, okay? That's a whole nother matter, right? But we do this, right? We want to be around people who are safe. But here's what happens when you have a rule like this. You start to think you're a good person if you haven't murdered anyone, right? Like, let's be honest. As a kid, has anyone ever thought, I'm a good person because I haven't murdered anyone, right? Like, you put up that rule. And we all do this. You know how you do this? Because you oftentimes come up and say, what does the Bible say about this? Is this a sin? You know what we're really asking in that moment? Where's the line? How close can I get to the line and not cross that line? Right? Because if I don't cross that line, I'll think I'm a good person. So here's the Jews. They're like, man, the line is we can't murder people. Oh, right. But I can be cruel. I can be hateful. I can be rude. I can insult someone. I can be angry with someone. Man, I can live like that. But as long as I don't cross that line, I'm a good person. I'm good with God. And that was the mindset. And we do the same thing. I remember as a teenager, first time I dated a girl, I remember having a conversation with my youth pastor like, how far is too far? Because really I just want to know what the line was. The line that say, if I don't cross this line, I'm good with God. And here's the mentality that people were in. Thinking, I'm good with God because I haven't crossed these lines. Because I've done these things, therefore God is pleased with me. He is happy with me. I'm all right with God. And then Jesus comes and he blows that out of the water with a single sentence. And he says this in response. Verse 22, he says, but I say to you. Now, that phrase, we're like, that doesn't mean anything. But if you were a first century Jew, that meant everything. Because with that single phrase, here's what Jesus is saying. He's like, you have heard of the Old Testament. You've heard of all the prophets. You've heard of the 10 Commandments. But I've got a word for you that is more important than that. And if you were a first century Jew, no one said that phrase. If you were a first century Jew and you heard someone say that phrase, you'd be like, let me find a rock. I need to hit this guy. Because in this moment, he's saying that what he is about to say is more important than the 10 Commandments. That's a scary thing to say. And here's what Jesus says. He says, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Now here's where Jesus starts to obliterate our line, right? Where we start to think, man, I'm good with God. Because here he's saying, like, have you ever been angry with anybody? You just lost your temper? I mean, I have. And let's be honest, when we get angry, we're not our best selves, right? We look back, years later, weeks later, whatever, and we're like, man, I did not respond the way I should have. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's like, man, you think you're a good person because you've never murdered anyone? Let's back it up and say the root of this is actually from your anger. Have you ever been angry with anybody? Have you ever just lost your temper and lost it on someone, on your wife, on your husband, on your kids? And you still think you're a good person? Man, let's continue. If you're uncomfortable, he adds more onto it. He continues in that same sentence. He says, whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. Ooh. Maybe you're like, man, I'm not an angry person, but I've insulted some people for any reason, maybe because they're on a different football team or they're a different political party or because they did something I just didn't like. I insulted them. I didn't care what I said behind their backs. That was just me. But I didn't murder them, so therefore I'm a good person, right? You see how this is challenging that mindset back then? How it challenges our mindset? And if you're uncomfortable, oh man, Jesus, he keeps adding on to it. He says, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. All right, so let's be honest. You don't have to feel a little embarrassed or uncomfortable in your seat this morning because we all feel that way. Because we're all like, man, I've messed this up. Here's Jesus, God's appointed king, the guy who's speaking on behalf of God, and he's saying, look, none of us are in a right standing with God because, why? We've lost our tempers with one another. We've lost it on others. We've insulted one another. We've been harsh towards one another. We've gossiped. We've said mean things behind each other's backs. Ooh. We've done it all from a place of anger. That's uncomfortable. But here's where Jesus is getting at. When he's talking about this in the context of worship, when he's talking about what does it mean to live as people who are saying, all hail the king, what he's trying to get us to see is that my anger compromises our worship. That is so important for us to grasp. I wanted to say that again, and I'm going to ask, would you say it with me? All right, here we go. My anger compromises our worship. Man, our faith is not just me and Jesus. It's a community thing. And so your anger, if left unchecked, if left unchained, can actually hurt the relationship with other people. And this is where Jesus starts to build up to his big point. And let me tell you, I'm just going to give you a spoiler. What Jesus says next, if you thought you were uncomfortable beforehand, this next part is scary. This next part, I'll be honest, I wish in almost one way that we could just skip it, that Jesus didn't have to say it, because the implications of it are really terrifying and really uncomfortable and really demanding. And here's what he says, the very next verse, as he's built up this theme about anger and worship. Verse 23, it says, so if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Let me read that again, because maybe that didn't sink in for you, and maybe you're like, I have no idea what we're talking about here. So let me read it again. Verse 23. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Think about how dramatic that is for the people who are hearing this. So Jesus, he's before this massive crowd, who are passionate about worshiping God. Man, they've got rules, they've got regulations, they've got these things that there's like, hey, if we don't break these lines, we're good with God. And he's like, man, you've probably just traveled 3 days, about 80 miles, to get to the temple to worship. And you get there, and while you're in line, you've been in line for hours, you're waiting for your opportunity for you and God to have your private moment. You get there, and then you remember back home, man, there's someone who is furious with you. Back home, there's someone that you have hurt or has hurt you. Back home, you've got this broken relationship over here. Here's what you do, according to Jesus, stop worshiping and go and fix that relationship. That makes me a little uncomfortable. And if you were a Jew, you're like, man, Jesus, you're talking about we just planned this day for weeks, for months. We just traveled 3 days of hiking. My legs are tired. And you're telling me to stop what I'm doing, to stop worshiping you and go back? And then when that is in better condition, then I can come back and worship you? Because the seriousness of what Jesus is saying, and let me tell you, what I'm about to say will sound like heresy if we did not just hear it from Jesus. Here's what Jesus is saying. My relationship with you comes before my worship with God. See how it's uncomfortable? And notice who is the initiators of this peace and reconciliation. Listen here. Verse 23. We're going to read it again. I'm going to emphasize some of the pronouns so you can catch it. It says, so if you are offering your gift to the altar, I mean, you're at church and you're worshiping, and there remember that your brother, meaning another follower of Jesus, has something against you. Notice who's the initiator here, of the one who's supposed to be seeking the peace. It's the victim. It's the one who's fine, who's like, man, oh yeah, I hurt that person back there, or maybe I've been hurt. And here's the thing. We oftentimes like to play the victim card, right? We're like, yeah, we'll talk about forgiveness. We'll talk about being peacemakers. We'll talk about being kind to others. But I've been the one who's been hurt by this other individual. They should come and talk to me, right? And here's where Jesus says, no. You know that there's a broken relationship back there. You know that that is not right, either because you've contributed to being wrong or someone else has done something. Man, they're frustrated with you. They're mad at you. You're happy with that? They're a fellow believer. They're a fellow Jesus follower, and you're like, I'm all right throwing them to the curb. I'm all right disrespecting them. I'm all right being angry with them. That's fine. I'm going to come and do my worship with Jesus. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to feel like a good person. I'm going to get my pat on the back. Who cares about the fact that I've just treated someone hatefully? That's really uncomfortable because we all do this. Here's Jesus saying, this can't be right. Because that's how the Jews were living in that day and age. They're like, man, as long as I don't cross this line, I can be hateful and cruel to everyone else because nothing came before my worship with Jesus or my worship of God. And here's Jesus and says, whoa. We need to back this up. And we need to change some things around. Because here's the point that Jesus is trying to make, and this is really affecting the way we come into worship. He's saying we cannot expect to be right with God if we are wrong with others. We cannot expect to be right with God if we are wrong with others. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, my shields are up, I don't like this, Mason, this sounds a little uncomfortable. I'd rather when it's just me and Jesus and me and my relationship with him, who cares about others? Let me go and explain this to you in an illustration that will make perfect sense to you. I heard this recently, this is not mine, but imagine most of your parents, in fact, let me go ahead and pick on someone, Brent, I just caught eyes with you. Sorry, I'm going to throw you under the bus and pick on you. Okay, so you've got 2 kids. Now imagine I came to you and I'm like, Brent, you're an awesome guy. You've got this awesome beard. I'm really jealous of it. That is really cool. But then I turn around and I insult your kids. And I say something harsh about them. And I insult them. But then I come back and I'm like, hey, let's talk about that beard. Let's talk about you're a man who knows the scriptures really well. Do you think you and me are going to be right, even though I say all the nice things about you when I just insulted your kids? I should have asked someone else. All right? The answer is no. Like me personally, I've got 2 kids, and I'm up on stage all this time, and you come up to me and you're like, Mason, that was a great sermon, but I need to tell you about how your daughter's a brat. I'm like, whoa, okay. Nothing you say is ever going to be good again, all right? Because you have insulted someone's kid. Think about it. As parents, we know this. So why should we be surprised when God says that he feels the same way? If we are God's children because of faith in Jesus, do you really think God is all right with the way that we talk about one another and we treat one another? You want to be good with God? Make sure you're treating other people with the love of Jesus. Like Dave talked about, when we ask ourselves the question, what does love require of me? What do we see of Jesus, of this love? It was self-sacrificing. It gave of himself. It did not seek his own glory. It sought to be there for others. Man, what does it look like then for us? If before we came into worship, man, you were just mean and cruel, and you were gossiping, and you were just fueled by your anger, and you were shouting and screaming, and you lost it on your kids, but then you get out of the car and you're smiling, you're like, yeah, Man, we cannot expect to be right with God if we are wrong with other people, and if we're all right with that. And so if we want to get past that mentality of thinking, man, worship doesn't mean anything to me, I get nothing out of it. Maybe part of the reason why you get nothing out of it is because there's a broken relationship that you're ignoring. Maybe because there's something in your life where God's like, hello, if you want to be right with me, if you want to have this feeling of, man, I was with God today, I heard from God, maybe you need to start doing what Jesus did. Seek love and forgiveness. I mean, we are the forgiven people. What does it say if we refuse to forgive others? Right, Brent? Should have called on someone else for that analogy. Man, we're the reconciled people. What does it say about us if we don't have any care and concern about reconciling with one another? So I think it's time that we get off our pedestals and we choose to be humble and we seek peace. And let me tell you, this is uncomfortable and demanding because it's so easy for us in so many ways to counter ourselves off, to give excuses. Maybe for you, you're like, I'm the self-righteous one, right? I sit there and think, man, what I did was right, and who cares if other people were hurt? I knew I was in the right, and so I did what was right. But here's the honest truth. God doesn't care. If the way we treat one another was broken and messy and hateful, because that wasn't the Jesus way. And maybe for some of you, you're like, well, I'm the victim here, right? I'm the one who's been hurt. They should come and talk to me. You don't know my family. You don't know my friends. You don't know my in-laws of what they've said and done to me. It should be them who comes and tries to make peace. And if that's the case, would Jesus ever come and saved us? Because he was the victim of how we treated him. Maybe for some of you, you're like, man, no, that's not my job because I have this status over here. They should come talk to me because either I'm older or younger or I have the higher experience or I have the higher education or whatever it is that makes you think that you should be the one that someone should come and apologize to. Maybe if that was the way Jesus operated, oh man, would he have come and saved any of us? This is uncomfortable, my friends. And I say this as one who struggles with this as well. And so I'm not sitting here judging anybody. I'm saying, look, if we want to be the people that God has called us to be, if we want to be the church that worships in such a way that says, all hail the King, and how we come in should be from a background of, man, I've sought to love like Jesus. I've sought to love the people that Jesus loves. I've sought to give and serve and be there for others because Jesus was there for me. Man, I think we all need that. Will you pray with me right now? Jesus, I'll be the first to admit, sometimes I'm all right with some broken relationships. I'm all right with the fact, man, I've hurt someone in the past, but it's okay. I'll just move on, sometimes move away even, and not deal with it. Jesus, I know I'm honest with the fact that, sometimes I wish, someone else should be the bigger man and make that step forward and try to reach reconciliation. I was the one who's hurt, so I should just sit back and they should come and apologize to me. Father, I'm just as likely to fall in that temptation. And I'm just as likely to convince myself I'm good with you because I haven't crossed certain lines or I haven't done certain things or because I have done things that I think adds weight to my value. Father, man, you kind of shatter that with just a few short sentences. You changed the game. That the way we show love to you is by how we love one another as you have loved us. So help us do better at that. Because right now we're watching a world that is it is happy and eager to hurt itself. We see that even amongst those who claim to be Jesus followers, we use social media as an easy way to hurt others. Father, please forgive us. Help us to change things. Help us to be the people who know that we've been forgiven, so we seek forgiveness. Help us to be the people who know that we've experienced peace from you, so we're going to seek peace with others. Who know we've been loved by you, so we're going to seek love from others. We know we've received grace from you, so we're going to give grace to others. We know we've received mercy from you, so we're going to give mercy to others because we want to be right with you. So therefore, we are going to live with the expectation, the eagerness, and the drive to love others, even the ones who drive us nuts, even the ones who hurt us. We're going to be the people who continue to show the love of Christ to them. Help us to be that. So the world might see you. The world itself might say, all hail King Jesus. It's in your name I pray. Amen.